Welcome back to another video lecture. This lecture will be a continuation of the first World War I video lecture that we ended, if you remember, with the United States declaring neutrality in 1914. President Wilson was very adamant in his belief that the United States had really no cause to be a participant in World War I, a European war that the United States really would be best to avoid and stay out of. Well, as things happened, as you know from your reading and from just your general knowledge of history, the United States would become, in fact, involved, entangled in Europe's war, and that really is due to the things that you discovered in the reading that you did in your textbook, the idea of German U-boat ships sinking passenger liners with Americans on board, the idea that the Germans had certain plans to spy and disrupt the United States by attacking certain facilities, factories, among other things, shipyards and things like that. So the United States did, in fact, find itself caught up in the affairs of Europe, in particular as well, the idea of business and banking. The United States quickly became the financial center of the world, and we were loaning the British and the French large sums of money, upwards of $2 billion, over $30 billion today, and maybe even more. I'm not sure. We'd have to do the calculation. And at the same time, we were really not engaged with Germany all that much. So one wonders whether, in fact, our neutrality was pure, as Wilson had urged and preached the United States to be neutral in mind, thought, and deed. It seems as though the United States did, in fact, favor England and France and Russia. But at any rate, today we're going to pick up with, let's see here, we'll pop to the first slide here, so bear with me. January 22nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson gave a major address, a foreign policy address, and it really became quickly known as the Peace Without Victory speech. And Wilson was really trying to get both sides, the Entente powers of England and France and Russia, to sit down at the table with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire to end the war without a clear victor on the battlefield. And Wilson believed that this would be possible because both sides had suffered huge losses. Both sides were really kind of at the end of their ability to sustain the war, and it had cost millions of lives, undue damages in property, and billions of dollars. So Wilson thought that he had an opening to try to get both sides to the table without a victor, and he really believed that this would lead to a stable and lasting peace where if there was no loser, there wouldn't be any hard feelings. So this is something that was rather interesting, and I just want to kind of quote to you some of Wilson's words from this very famous speech. And he said that in fact, victory would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's terms imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which terms of peace would rest, not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. Only a peace between equals can last. Only a peace, the very principle which is equality and common participation in the common benefit. So Wilson is really outlining the idea that if there is a victor and therefore there is a loser, that any peace was going to be short-lived and that it would likely cause future problems. And Wilson was actually very prophetic in this sense, and he could not know that then in January of 1917. Nobody could, but as we have the benefit of knowing history, Wilson's words, as I said, turned out to be prophetic, and the peace arrangement that was arranged at the conclusion of World War I, where the Allies, the British, the French, and the Russians, with the Americans, declare themselves to be the victors, and Germany to be the vanquished or the losers, really did kind of create ill will and sort of laid the foundations for troubles that would erupt in the 1930s and in the 1940s in a conflict that we call World War II. So, but I want to go on and look at a couple other things that Wilson proposed in this speech, again, the Peace Without Victory speech, and he said that really nations ought to refrain from trying to control one another. They ought to stay out of the business of trying to make themselves larger by acquiring territories, by creating colonies or interfering with other nations. And he invoked the name of President Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine in doing so, and said that this would be the way of development, unhindered, unthreatened, unafraid, the little along with the great and the powerful. So Wilson basically says in the Monroe Doctrine, if you remember, said, look, let's not get involved in Europe's affairs. Europe, don't get involved in our affairs here in the United States. And if everybody kind of stays within their own sort of backyard, if you will, there really won't be any reason for wars to break out. And what really can then happen is nations can learn to live side by side, to cooperate, to develop trade relations that will allow civilization to advance. And that was Wilson's idea. He also said that nations should also not engage in competitions of power or selfish rivalry, and that they should not engage or be involved in alliances. And really one of the reasons that World War I breaks out is because of this elaborate alliance system that was in many ways secret at the time. Of course, now we know all about it, but at the time nations didn't know the full extent and nature of the alliances. So Wilson says, look, alliances tend to lead to wars. Kind of interesting because George Washington, our first president back in 1796, in his farewell address, said something very similar. So we see a certain connection or continuity in history, and I've talked about that continuity before in class. So hopefully you can see that there are connections, and some things in history do in fact continue and or repeat themselves. And the last thing I want to say is that Wilson proposed in this speech that the best form of government was the consent of the governed, whereby you have the people selecting their own leaders, and that is the consent of the people choosing their own leaders. And that really leads to a more permanent, peaceful foundation for governments. And if all governments were built upon the principle of the consent of the governed, then maybe wars would not be involved. Now here, just a brief side note. One must remember that Germany was not a democracy. Austria-Hungary was not a democracy. Russia was not a democracy. The Ottoman Empire was not a democracy. England was, though it had a monarch. And France was really the purest and truest form of democratic government in Europe. So it's rather interesting that Wilson is kind of outlining the idea that things needed to change in Europe. And again, governments that are not built on the idea of consent of the governed might tend to lead to future wars. And this address then really is Wilson formulating American principles and American policies. And this is kind of very important, and he really looks to the world and looks to, as he called it, forward-looking men and women everywhere, of every modern nation, of every enlightened community. Enlightened meaning to be educated, to be reasonable, to be rational. And he said, these are the principles of mankind, and these principles must prevail. Prevail over what, you might ask? And again, the principles are looking forward to a time when all nations would be built on the consent of governed, when freedom and liberty would be at the heart of every nation, where you wouldn't have empires with emperors and or monarchies, kings and queens, but people ruling themselves. And Wilson is trying to engage the entire world in this attempt, and it really is something that we're going to see later on when we look at the Peace Conference and when we talk about Wilson's 14 points. Okay, so I hope that was useful, and moving quickly forward, you guys know that Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare at the end of January 31st, 1917. So Wilson's attempt to bring the two sides together really lasted, all of 9 days. So he delivered that peace with that victory speech on January 22nd. By January 31st, Germany has already declared that it's going to resume unrestricted subwarfare. And you can see in this map what's called the war zone around the British Isles, and that's the area or territory that Germany said is off limits to all neutral ships, whether they be merchant ships or passenger ships. They were going to be targeted. Germany at this point had been suffering starvation and privation. They were kind of at the end of their rope, so they're going to pursue this policy. The other thing that you remember from the reading is the Zimmermann Telegram, whereby Germany tried to create an alliance with Mexico, in fact inducing or encouraging Mexico to attack the southwest portion of the United States, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona that you see there in the map, territories that had been lost by Mexico to the United States in the now distant War of 1848. So again, we see history playing a role here. Mexicans had never really accepted the U.S. acquisition of those territories, and so this was an attempt by Germany to create instability on the southwestern border of the United States to keep it occupied from then joining the European war. And of course that did not work. This alliance did not work. However, it did really stir up feelings in the United States and pushed us that much closer to war. And here you really see the end result of Germany's failed policies, the resumption of unrestricted German warfare against U.S. merchant ships in the war zone. And in March of 1917, 3 different U.S. merchant ships were sunk. And that's really what's going to lead to this next slide, where you see Woodrow Wilson addressing Congress and stating the U.S. position in his war address to Congress, where he asks for a declaration of war. And famously, Wilson said, and I quote, "The right is more precious than the peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority." And again, remember, most of Europe was living under empires or emperors and or monarchs, and had to submit to authority because that's how it worked. So he's really reaching out to those people in Europe and the rest of the world, I would say. And he's saying to those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments for the rights and liberties of small nations. So Wilson is saying that the United States is going to go to war to protect these basic rights. The United States is not going to go to war to enlarge its territory, to secure natural resources, to secure trade routes, or to protect trade routes. So the United States is really announcing that it is sort of a different animal in the kingdom of animal nations. We go to war only to promote civilization and to promote these rights. So again, one of the essential questions that I had asked is, when does a nation go to war? Or why does a nation go to war? And I think Wilson does a very good job here of clearly announcing, very clearly, and again, this is something modern presidents do, announcing to the world in a very clear, succinct way, a vision. The United States goes to war to protect and promote these certain rights that are more precious than the peace. So if necessary, the United States will fight, though we prefer peace. And so the United States was going to really kind of promote and defend the rights of all humans and of human civilization. And this is really important because it gets at the heart of American foreign policy. It explains really the next 100 years. If you look at the United States' involvement in different conflicts throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, you can still hear echoes of this theme that the United States is promoting basic rights, democracy, and freedoms. That's something that is very important. And it also really kind of gets back to the American identity, who we are and what we believe. And these are principles, I think, that inspire and motivate us. They inform us, and they're something that in a sense we care about deeply. So I hope that that's been useful. And at this point, we're going to end here and pick up the next time with this idea of, well, okay, we declare war, now what? the United States had a very small army, not very well prepared, not very well equipped, and we had a huge amount of work to be done if we were going to actually land an army in Europe and help make a difference. So we'll pick up there next time. Thanks.